May 12, 1945, Kreuzberg district. Berlin, 15-year-old Klaus Becker crouched behind a pile of rubble, the Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon heavy and awkward across his thin shoulders. His hands trembled from fear, exhaustion, and 3 days without real food. The uniform they'd given him 2 weeks ago hung loosely on his frame. The Volkssturm armband felt like a noose around his bicep. Through the dust and smoke he heard them coming. The grinding treads of American tanks, the shouts in English, the systematic advance that had swept through the city block by block, house by house. His unit, if you could call 12 terrified boys and 3 old men a unit, had fallen back until there was nowhere left to retreat. His Hitler Youth training echoed in his head. The Americans are barbarians who will kill prisoners. Better to die fighting for the Führer than surrender to beasts who show no mercy. His squadron leader, an SS officer who had disappeared yesterday, had been explicit. They will torture you, then execute you. Fight to the death or use your last bullet on yourself. Klaus had believed it completely. Why wouldn't he? It was all he had been told for years. Americans were subhuman monsters. Surrender meant torture and death. His only choices were victory or death. The tank rumbled closer. Klaus lifted the Panzerfaust, trying to remember the abbreviated training. Point, aim, fire. His 14-year-old friend Friedrich had tried using one yesterday. The backblast had knocked him unconscious, and he had been shot while lying stunned in the street, killed by machine gun fire before he could even get up. Klaus's finger found the trigger. The tank was maybe 30 meters away now, close enough he could hit it maybe. Probably not, but if he didn't fire, if he didn't fight, he was a coward. He was betraying the Führer, betraying Germany, betraying everything. The tank stopped. The turret traversed, aiming at his position. Klaus closed his eyes, waiting for the main gun to fire and end him. Instead, a voice loud and speaking terrible German came. "Come out, boy. Weapons down!" Klaus froze. They were calling him boy, not enemy, not target, boy. The voice came again, firmer but not cruel. "We won't shoot. Come out." Klaus stayed frozen. This had to be a trick. They would shoot him the moment he showed himself. The propaganda had been clear. Americans killed prisoners. But the propaganda had also said the Wehrmacht would never retreat, that Germany was winning, that the Führer had secret weapons that would turn the war. Klaus had watched the Wehrmacht collapse. He'd seen Berlin burn. The secret weapons had never appeared. What if the propaganda about Americans was also lies? He set down the Panzerfaust with trembling hands, stood slowly, raising his arms above his head. His voice cracked when he shouted back, "Don't shoot!" 3 American soldiers appeared from behind the tank, rifles raised, but not firing. They were huge. Klaus had been told Americans were weaklings, but these men looked like giants in their combat gear. One was black. The propaganda had said black American soldiers were especially savage. Klaus closed his eyes again, waiting for bullets. But instead, someone grabbed his shoulder. Klaus flinched, expecting a knife or a club. Instead, the hand steadied him, almost gentle. When he opened his eyes, one of the Americans, the black soldier he had been taught to fear most, was handing him a canteen. "Trinken," the American said in broken German. "Drink." Klaus stared at the canteen, at the soldier's face, which showed concern rather than cruelty. His hands, still shaking, reached for the water, offered by an enemy who was supposed to kill him, but was instead giving him drink. He drank. The water was clean, cool, better than anything he'd tasted in weeks. When he finished, the American took the canteen back, nodded, and gestured toward the rear where other prisoners were being gathered. No torture, no execution, just water, a nod, and directions to join other captives who were sitting on the ground. Guarded but unharmed, some already eating from army rations the Americans had distributed. Klaus walked toward them in a daze, his entire worldview collapsing with each step. The monsters were giving him water. The barbarians weren't executing prisoners. Everything he'd been told was lies, and the truth was so unexpected he couldn't process it. The desperate gamble, the Volkssturm, was Nazi Germany's final attempt to stave off defeat by throwing children and old men against Allied armies. Created by Hitler's decree on September 25, 1944, the Volkssturm conscripted all males aged 16 to 60 who weren't already in military service. As Germany's situation grew desperate, the age limits were ignored, and boys as young as 12 found themselves drafted. Some volunteered, indoctrinated by years of Hitler Youth propaganda. Others were essentially kidnapped, taken from schools, from their homes, given armbands and obsolete weapons, and sent to defend positions against professional armies. The numbers told the story of desperation. Total Volkssturm conscription 1944-45, approximately 6 million men and boys, actual combat deployment. Roughly 1.5 million saw action teenagers in combat, ages 12 and 17. Estimated 100,000 teenager casualties. Estimated 40,000, 60,000 killed. Unknown wounded training period, typically 1 to 2 weeks, sometimes only days. Equipment, whatever could be found, obsolete rifles, captured weapons, Panzerfausts, makeshift explosives. The children recruited into this force had been conditioned by years of Hitler Youth indoctrination. They had been taught that dying for the Führer was glorious, that retreat was cowardice, that surrender was unthinkable dishonor. They had been shown propaganda films, portraying Allied soldiers as subhuman monsters. They genuinely believed that capture meant torture and execution. Klaus Becker's experience was typical. At 15 years old, he had been in the Hitler Youth since he was 10. Every week, military drills and ideological training conditioned him to believe in German racial superiority and the barbarism of the Allies. When the Volkssturm conscripted him in early April 1945, he was terrified but also oddly proud to be defending Berlin, fighting for Germany, serving the Führer. The reality of combat shattered those illusions. Within hours, his unit received only 3 days of training: how to fire a rifle, how to use a Panzerfaust, and where to aim at tanks. Then they were sent to defensive positions in Kreuzberg, with instructions to hold against the American forces advancing through the district. "We were 12 boys and 3 old men," Klaus recalled in a 1987 interview. "The oldest boy was 17, the youngest was 13. We had 8 rifles between us, 4 Panzerfausts, and maybe 50 bullets total. Our officer was an SS corporal who told us we'd be shot if we retreated. Then he disappeared the first day. We were children with guns, terrified, hungry, waiting to die. The propaganda that killed Nazi propaganda had spent years conditioning German children to fear capture more than death. The messaging was systematic and pervasive. School textbooks described Allied atrocities. Radio broadcasts detailed supposed massacres of German prisoners, and films portrayed American and British soldiers as sadistic monsters. Hitler Youth leaders reinforced these messages weekly. Surrender meant torture, rape, execution. Better to die fighting than face what the enemy would do to you. For children already indoctrinated in Nazi racial ideology, this propaganda found fertile ground. They had been taught since the age of 6 that they were superior, that enemies were subhuman, that Germans deserved to rule while others deserved to serve or die. The idea that these subhuman enemies would commit atrocities if they won seemed logically consistent with everything else they had been taught. The psychological impact was profound. Many German child soldiers genuinely believed that death in combat was preferable to capture. Some carried cyanide capsules or saved their last bullet for themselves. Others would fight to the point of unconsciousness rather than surrender. The concept of American mercy was literally unimaginable. It contradicted everything they had been conditioned to believe. 16-year-old Hermann Schultz, captured near Würzburg in April 1945, described his terror. "I'd been told Americans skinned prisoners alive, that they cut off body parts as trophies, that they tortured Germans for entertainment. When American soldiers surrounded our position and called for surrender, I tried to kill myself. I put my rifle barrel in my mouth. An American knocked it away before I could fire. I was crying, begging him to just shoot me quickly. He looked horrified. He kept saying something I didn't understand. Later I learned it was Jesus Christ. He's just a kid, but at the time I thought he was getting ready to torture me. This conditioning made child soldiers extremely dangerous in combat. They would fight with suicidal determination, knowing or believing that capture meant fates worse than death. American forces advancing through Germany encountered pockets of fanatical resistance from teenagers who had been psychologically primed to prefer death over surrender. The first encounters American forces had in early 1945 with these child soldiers were unprepared for. Combat veterans who had fought across Europe suddenly found themselves facing opponents who were obviously underage, boys with adolescent faces, thin from malnutrition, wearing uniforms several sizes too large. The cognitive dissonance was immediate and disturbing. These were children, some young enough to be the American sons or little brothers, yet they were firing weapons and needed to be neutralized. The rules of engagement were clear. Armed enemies were legitimate targets regardless of age, but the emotional reality was complicated. American soldiers, who had spent months fighting Wehrmacht professionals, found themselves deeply uncomfortable shooting teenagers. Some hesitated fatally, while German child soldiers killed or wounded American troops who couldn't bring themselves to fire on children. Others overcame their hesitation and shot, then dealt with the psychological consequences afterward. Sergeant Robert Mitchell of the 3rd Infantry Division described his first encounter with Volkssturm child soldiers near Nuremberg. "We were clearing a village when fire came from a building. We returned fire, then stormed the position. Inside were 5 kids, maybe 14 or 15 years old. 2 were dead from our fire. 3 surrendered. They were terrified, crying, expecting us to execute them. The guy next to me started crying too. He had a son about that age back home. We just killed children because they were shooting at us." There was no good answer to that situation. These encounters created impossible moral dilemmas. German children, indoctrinated and armed, posed genuine threats, but killing children, even armed hostile children, violated fundamental human instincts and the norms of civilized warfare. American soldiers found themselves caught between military necessity and moral revulsion. The solution most units adopted was aggressive attempts to capture rather than kill. When encountering obvious child soldiers, American forces would call for surrender in German, use loudspeakers to encourage capitulation, and hold fire when possible to give children opportunities to quit fighting. This wasn't official policy. It was individual soldiers and small unit leaders who adopted this approach, making moral choices in real time. The Mercy Decision, the systematic sparing of German child soldiers, represented collective American decision-making at every level: individual soldiers, unit commanders, division leadership, and occupation authorities. At the tactical level, soldiers who encountered child soldiers often chose to risk their own lives to avoid killing children. They would advance more cautiously, call for surrender more insistently, hold fire longer than tactically prudent, and some deliberately aimed to wound rather than kill. Others would bypass child soldier positions entirely if possible, leaving them for follow-on units to deal with. Private Eugene Henderson described his approach. "If I saw a kid with a gun, I'd try everything to get him to surrender before I'd shoot. I'd yell, 'Drop your weapon, boy,' in German. I'd learned the phrase specifically for this. I'd fire warning shots. I'd wait longer than was safe, because if I killed a child, even an armed hostile child, I wasn't sure I could live with that. Some guys did kill kids because they had to, but I tried everything to avoid it." At the command level, policies emerged to handle captured child soldiers differently than adult prisoners. Medical care was prioritized, food rations were increased, interrogations were gentler, and repatriation to families was expedited when possible. These weren't codified regulations, but practical responses to the uncomfortable reality that American forces were capturing enemy combatants who were obviously children. The psychological impact on American troops was significant. Many soldiers struggled with having killed or wounded child soldiers in combat. Chaplains reported increased counseling requests, and some soldiers wrote home about their moral confusion. "I killed a German boy who couldn't have been older than 14, wrote Corporal James Walsh to his wife in May 1945. "He had a Panzerfaust and was about to fire at our tank. I shot him. It was justified. He was armed, hostile, dangerous, but he was a child. When I close my eyes, I see his face. I don't know how to feel about it. I'm glad I'm alive, but I'm haunted by his death." Klaus Becker's transformation. For Klaus Becker and tens of thousands of other German child soldiers, capture initiated psychological transformation as profound as any combat trauma. In the hours after his surrender, Klaus sat with other captured Volkssturm members, 14 boys ranging from 13 to 17 years old. American soldiers had given them water, field rations, and blankets. A medic was treating minor wounds, and guards watched them but showed no cruelty. The expected torture and execution weren't happening. Instead, Klaus observed Americans behaving professionally, almost casually. They'd secured the prisoners, provided basics, and moved on to other tasks. The captured children weren't special threats or targets of revenge. They were just another administrative problem to process. This normality was psychologically devastating. Klaus had spent weeks preparing to die gloriously for Germany. He'd believed capture meant unspeakable atrocities. Instead, he was sitting on rubble, eating American crackers, while his captors mostly ignored him because they had more important things to do. "I kept waiting for the torture to start," Klaus recalled. "I'd look at the American guards trying to see the cruelty I'd been promised, but they just looked bored, professional. One was eating chocolate, another was reading a letter. They weren't monsters preparing to hurt us. They were just soldiers doing their job, and their job apparently included not killing prisoners." An African-American soldier, the one who'd given Klaus water initially, approached with more rations. Klaus flinched, expecting violence. The soldier noticed and stopped, spoke in careful German. "Niemand wird dir wehtun. No one will hurt you." Klaus stared. An American, a black American, supposedly the most savage according to propaganda, was reassuring him of his safety, using words chosen specifically to address his fear, showing concern for a child who had tried to kill Americans hours earlier. "That was the moment," Klaus said decades later, "when that soldier told me no one would hurt me, and I could see in his eyes he meant it. That's when I understood everything I'd believed was propaganda. The lies about American brutality, the racial superiority nonsense, the faith in the future, it all collapsed. Because a man I'd been taught was subhuman showed me more humanity than my own government ever had. The POW camps." German child soldiers sent to POW camps experienced ongoing challenges to their indoctrination, as they discovered American imprisonment meant survival rather than death. The camps held mixed populations, Wehrmacht veterans, SS troops, Volkssturm members ranging from teenagers to old men. The younger prisoners quickly became known to guards and camp administrators, who made informal accommodations for their age. Extra rations were common, educational programs were organized, and some camps separated child prisoners from adults to prevent exploitation or continued indoctrination by hardcore Nazis. American chaplains paid special attention to younger prisoners, concerned about their psychological state and future prospects. Klaus Becker spent 7 months in a POW camp near Mannheim, and his experiences of German child soldiers contradicted everything the propaganda had promised about captivity. "We were fed regularly, better than I'd eaten in months before capture," Klaus recalled. "We had shelter, medical care, even some recreation. The guards were professional, not cruel. Some were kind. I learned English from a guard who brought me books. He had sons my age and treated me almost like I was one of them." The camps became sites of denazification through direct experience rather than formal re-education. Child soldiers who had believed in Nazi ideology discovered that Americans weren't monsters, that propaganda had been systematically false, and their suffering had been for lies. Hermann Schultz described his transformation in the camp. I had time to think without the constant fear and propaganda. I talked to other prisoners, including adults who admitted the war had been wrong. I saw how Americans treated us fairly, humanely, without the cruelty we'd been promised. Slowly, I had to face the truth. I'd fought for evil. I'd been taught lies. Americans weren't the enemy. The Nazis were. Understanding that was painful, but necessary. When German child soldier POWs were repatriated to their families after the war, they carried memories that would shape their entire lives and post-war German attitudes toward America. Klaus Becker returned to Berlin in November 1945. The city was in ruins. His family's home was destroyed. His father was dead on the Eastern Front, and his mother was living in a basement. But Klaus himself was healthy, well-fed from American rations, carrying American-supplied clothes and a letter from the guard who'd taught him English. His mother barely recognized him. She had assumed he was dead. Volkssturm casualties had been so high. When Klaus explained he had been captured and held by Americans, she was shocked he'd survived. When he described his treatment, the food, the medical care, the relative kindness, she cried. All the propaganda had told us Americans would kill prisoners, she said. I'd grieved for you, certain you were dead or worse. Now you come home healthy, fed, treated well by the people who were supposed to be monsters. Everything they told us was lies. This pattern repeated across Germany. Families expecting their children to have been killed or brutalized instead received them back alive, often healthier than when conscripted. The contrast between propaganda and reality created a foundation for post-war German attitudes toward America. The psychological impact on the former child soldiers was profound and lasting. Many became advocates for democracy, peace, and German-American friendship. They had experienced firsthand the difference between Nazi lies and American reality. This created generational effects. Their children and grandchildren heard stories about Americans sparing their fathers' and grandfathers' lives, treating them humanely, and sending them home instead of exacting revenge. Peter Hoffman, whose leg had been saved by American doctors, later wrote, "I owe my life to Americans who had every reason to let me die. I'd shot at them. I'd tried to kill them. They saved me anyway. That mercy taught me more about morality and civilization than any ideology. I spent my life after the war working for peace and democracy because Americans showed me what civilized people do. They spare their enemies when they can." Child soldier encounters in March and May 1945 saw an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 child soldiers in combat against American forces. Approximately 15,000 to 20,000 were killed in action, 12,000 to 15,000 wounded, and 18,000 to 25,000 captured. About 95% of the captured child soldiers were repatriated alive, with a notably higher survival rate than among adult German POWs. This reflected both American prioritization of children's welfare and lower rates of disease and complications among younger prisoners. Medical care statistics for child soldiers receiving treatment in American facilities showed approximately 200 surgical procedures, 8 to 92 amputations, often due to combat trauma, and 134 prosthetics provided. Post-war medical follow-up was arranged for approximately 2,800 cases, and an estimated 20,000 child soldiers processed through POW camps were provided education and vocational training while imprisoned. The average time in custody was 6 to 9 months, with 8,000 released to families or social services. Less than 500 child soldier deaths occurred in American custody, reflecting humane treatment and care for young prisoners. These numbers documented that American forces, when faced with child soldiers in combat, killed when necessary but captured when possible, treated the wounded without regard to age or nationality, imprisoned humanely, and released systematically. The contrast with Nazi treatment of enemies, or even of its own children sent to die, was absolute. The moral reckoning for American soldiers who fought against and captured German child soldiers created lasting moral complexities. Many struggled with having killed children, even armed hostile children who had been trying to kill them. The psychological burden persisted for decades. Veterans would describe dreams about teenage faces, guilt about actions that were militarily justified but emotionally devastating. Sergeant Robert Mitchell, who killed 2 Volkssturm teenagers in combat near Nuremberg, carried that burden for 50 years. "I did what I had to do. They were shooting at us. They'd have killed my men if I hadn't stopped them. I know intellectually I made the right choice, but emotionally I killed children. That's something I've had to live with every day since. I see their faces. I wonder who they might have become if Hitler hadn't sent them to die." Others found redemption through capturing and sparing child soldiers when possible. Private Eugene Henderson, who made extraordinary efforts to avoid killing children in combat, described complex feelings about his actions, knowing he had spared young lives despite the dangers they posed. "I'm glad I didn't have to kill kids. But I also feel guilty about the American soldiers who died because someone else hesitated or showed mercy. That got them killed." War forces impossible choices. "I made the choices I could live with, but that doesn't mean they were easy or without cost." The experience influenced post-war American attitudes toward Germany and the militarization of children. American forces occupying Germany enforced strict demilitarization, including abolishing all Hitler Youth organizations and military training for minors. The memory of fighting child soldiers created a determination to prevent any future generation from being similarly exploited. "We'd fought children who'd been turned into weapons," reflected Captain William Hayes, who'd commanded troops in Germany. "That wasn't their fault. It was their government's crime. Our job after the war was to make sure German children would never be used that way again. That meant building a democratic Germany where children went to school, not battlefields." The closing image, Berlin, May 1945, a makeshift American processing center for German POWs. Klaus Becker sat with 14 other former Volkssturm members, boys aged 13 to 17, waiting to be transported to permanent camps. They'd been captured at various times over the past week, brought here, fed, given basic medical checks, and now waited for whatever came next. An American soldier, the same black soldier who'd given Klaus water on the day of his capture, approached with a crate. He opened it to reveal chocolate bars and distributed them to the German boys, 1 per prisoner, speaking in broken German. "For you, good children." Klaus stared at the chocolate bar. The last time he'd tasted chocolate was before the war, when he was 9 years old, 6 years ago, when the world had still made sense, when he'd been a child instead of a soldier. The American noticed Klaus's expression. "War is over," he said. "War is over." Then in English, that Klaus was beginning to understand, "You get to be kids again." Klaus looked around at the other boys. Some were crying silently, others were staring at their chocolate like Klaus, unable to process this simple kindness from people they'd been taught were monsters. A few were already eating, the immediate pleasure of sugar overcoming weeks of propaganda conditioning. Klaus took a bite. The sweetness was overwhelming, not just the chocolate, but the meaning. The Americans had defeated them, captured them, and instead of the torture and execution they'd been promised, they received chocolate instead of revenge, mercy instead of death, life. And the chance to be children again. Klaus began crying. Not from fear, hunger, or pain, but from the collapse of everything he'd believed. The propaganda had been lies. The Americans weren't monsters. He'd nearly died fighting for evil, and the people who'd defeated that evil were treating him with more kindness than his own government had ever shown. The American soldier looked concerned. "Alles gut? Everything okay?" Klaus nodded, unable to speak. He held up the chocolate bar in trembling hands, a gesture of thanks that transcended language barriers. The soldier understood, nodded back, and moved on to distribute more chocolate to more children who'd been sent to fight and kill for a regime that had betrayed them. In that moment, with chocolate melting in his mouth and tears streaming down his face, Klaus Becker understood what mercy meant. It meant Americans giving chocolate to German boys who tried to kill them. It meant treating children like children, even when those children had been turned into soldiers. It meant choosing humanity over hatred, forgiveness over revenge, future possibility over past crimes. The war was over. Klaus Becker was 15 years old, and for the first time in years, he had a future worth living for. Given to him by enemies who'd become his liberators, who'd shown him that even after the worst humanity could inflict, mercy remained possible.